you all for being here and for inviting me to come and speak. My presentation is an evolution. It's based on many people's interviews with many people, speaking with people in impacted areas. But just about every statement that I make here is based on peer-reviewed literature. And some of the links are actually on the PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to leave and can be made available to any of you. And also additional notes will be made available to you so that you can actually look up these articles so that you know that these statements are based in fact. So I'm going to cover three areas: the scope and define some of the health impacts. Nadia has given a great overview. And then also, well, speaking about the environmental impacts that would be a problem and potentially cause the health impacts. Are you all familiar with the process of unconventional gas development? It involves many steps. People speak about fracking, which is actually only one small part of the process. That's okay. It involves the use of silica, high volumes of water that, especially in the West, are problematic because it causes significant depletion, but it can also deplete your small streams. There's transport of large amounts of materials, the fracking, the storage of materials, the infrastructure. My presentation will focus just on those last steps, the infrastructure. But we know that the environmental problems, as Nadia has outlined, have been encountered throughout the whole process. For example, exposure during the mining of silica can cause silicosis, which is an incurable disease. The water withdrawal, as I mentioned, significant water depletion in a time when water is, in some areas, is a scarcity. There can be spills during the transport. Aquifers can become contaminated during drilling or fracking with methane and also with the chemicals because of casing failure, documented. There could be exposure to radionuclides. Those are carcinogenic. Air pollution with ozone production from transport vehicles, which are often diesel vehicles. And then during the venting, flaring, compressor station emissions cause health impacts. Disposal of waste is a problem because there really isn't any good place to put all of this toxic material. Noise and light pollution occur, which causes their own set of problems, and there are health issues from climate change. And during all of these steps and the whole cumulative impact on communities causes significant psychological stress because there's a concern about loss of home value, loss of water, and impacts on health. To transport and distribute the gas produced mostly from the Appalachian Basin new compressor stations and pipelines are being built. The graph is showing the existing pipelines in blue, and the red dots are the compressor stations. Just a little bit about what the process is. Pipelines are needed to transport the gas. They can't be transported by truck. So either they flare the gas, for example, in the northern plains states, where they're actually digging for oil, they're flaring the gas, they're wasting it because it's not bringing as much money on the market at this moment. That's causing significant pollution. But part of the problem is they don't have the infrastructure in place to transport that gas. But here, they're planning on moving the gas eventually to market including to export this gas to other countries, which already have signed contracts with the United States with several specific export terminals. But to carry this gas to market, the pressure that's needed ranges from 500 to 1,000 pounds per square inch, or PSI. As a reference, automobile tires are inflated with compressed air, and that's at about 30 to 50 pounds per square inch. So the compressor stations need to be built about every 50 to 100 miles to push this gas. It doesn't just flow, it needs to be pushed. And the compressor stations are built to do that, and about one every 50 to 100 miles. Although in Pennsylvania you see a greater number of them there. Part of it is because there's a lot more that needs to be gathering lines. So where the active gas drilling is going on, and I understand that there are quite a few leases in this area. If gas development should ever be done here, you can expect that sort of build out as well. Many, many more compressor stations than just this one. Compressors release combustion products, nitrogen oxide, and volatile organic hydrocarbons. And as Nadia mentioned, it can, I'll go into the health impacts more later. Besides the health problems, issues, safety can be of concern because we have a department, that administration that's tasked with protecting and assuring that accidents don't occur, and that's the Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. They gather data, they set up rules, and they issue reports, and a lot of them are online at their website. They've developed, and also Department of Energy and also the industry have developed something called PIGs, Pipeline Inspection Gadgets, or gizmos, and they are supposed to inspect the pipelines. I understand the pipelines you have here are aging. So that's something to consider. An aging pipeline has its own set of additional problems, some of which I'll get into later. So the size compressor station that you'll have here is about 11,000 horsepower, and it will probably emit, based on what we know from other compressor stations of equal size, about 60,000 tons of pollutants into the air, and that includes known carcinogens and neurotoxins. That should be actually listed on the application, which you should be able to find on the FERC website, and I've given the number. Just delete the last 3 zeros when you go to the FERC website, and you'll find the information. Go ahead. The volume of emissions from compressor stations is significant. There was a 2013 RAND study that was done on air emissions in Pennsylvania, and they determined that 60 to 75% of estimated damages, and that was several $1 million of damages, were mostly due to health problems, and that 60 to 75% were due to compressor station activities. So just beginning to estimate for you how much infrastructure contributes to the overall pollution that the gas development could bring. So you're getting just the compressor. If you were to get, but that already we know produces a lot of emissions. And then these slides were adapted from a presentation at the Institute of Medicine by Dr. Robinson, who's with the Carnegie Mellon University, and his estimates, you can see in the pink, those are the compressor station emissions in the Marcellus Shale. He has 2 data sets, 2009 and projected for 2020, and what the compressor stations will be emitting as far as nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds. So the components of natural gas and pipelines are methane, light and heavy alkanes, the BTEX, this whole list. And the way they're produced, how they're sourced, how they're emitted is through emissions and also waste from transport vehicles. There's combustion at compressor stations, storage and condensate tanks are also present on site, and that's something that DEC will likely be giving permits for, so pay attention to that set of hearings. There are also metering stations going to be along this, but you probably will not have a metering station right in your backyard. But they are like small processing plants. And the infrastructure should be considered part of all of the industry that's in an area as a cumulative impact, and we know also that it's costly to health. So some of the health impacts that are associated with infrastructure emissions, nitrogen oxide is associated with respiratory disease. Low levels can cause eye, nose, throat, and lung irritation. Symptoms would be coughing, shortness of breath. People might be tired, they might be nauseous. And high levels of exposure can seriously damage tissues. Again, in the respiratory tract, and it could also lead to buildup of fluid in the lungs. Volatile organic compounds are neurotoxins, hepatotoxins, which means they affect the liver. They're toxic to the liver. They cause reproductive problems, cause wastage of fetuses, and they cause skin irritation. Short-term exposure to volatile organic compounds can irritate the respiratory tract and cause dizziness and headaches. Long-term exposure is linked to cancer and adverse neurological, reproductive, and developmental effects. They can also contribute to the production of ozone when combined with heat and sunlight. Sulfur compounds also are associated with respiratory. So you see, just beginning to see, I think, that it's hard to pinpoint which particular compound is actually causing a particular symptom because there is quite an overlap. So the sulfur compounds at high levels, sulfur dioxide, can cause breathing difficulty for people with asthma, and the long-term exposures to sulfur compounds can aggravate cardiovascular disease. It also reacts with nitrogen oxide, and it can damage ecosystems, and exposure to ozone can also damage your crops. Particulate matter is a soot-like material, and it forms when you burn anything. Particulate matter can be just a few microns small, so small that you can't even see it with your naked eye, or it can be somewhat larger, but it's soot-like. And you can imagine that when you breathe it in, it creates a large surface area for stuff that has attached itself to this particulate matter to cause additional problems in the lungs. You can't exhale that stuff. So any fossil fuel combustion can cause the production of particulate matter, and it actually has caused neurological problems, brain lesions, and this is documented with peer-reviewed literature in laboratory animals, causing symptoms that are similar to some psychiatric problems in humans. Small increases in particulate matter predisposes to increased risk of cardiovascular disease in the form of heart attacks and strokes, respiratory disease from asthma attacks and lung cancer, and newborn diseases, and also children's allergies, ear, nose, and throat problems. And also older people will have exacerbations if they already have an underlying disease like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It will get worse. Formaldehyde causes cancer. Other aldehydes, formaldehyde you might know is a pickling material. People use it to embalm or, so it's a material that really causes a thinning of the mucosa and also a irritation of the mucosa. So some of the nosebleeds that we might be seeing in children could actually be due to some of these aldehydes. PCBs are prohibited at this moment, but the aging pipelines, there used to be an awful lot of PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, which are now prohibited, but there used to be significant amount of use. There's no way to actually eliminate them from the pipelines, so there is still a lot of this in there. So as they clean it out and as they go through the pipeline with these pigs or otherwise workers welding old pipelines, and in compressor stations they could actually gather. So the radioactivity, very briefly because I'm running out of time, there's a, I'm going to just focus on the lower slide, which is from a 2008 publication from the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. And they describe very well something that is denied all the time when you make comments to either to one of the pipeline companies, which is that you're concerned about radon or polonium or lead. Polonium and lead are byproducts of radon. They're the daughter products, decay products of radon. Radon travels with methane. Polonium and lead are solid, and after the decay, 3.8 days is the maximum amount of time that radon lives, it becomes either polonium or lead. And so this precipitates on the lining of the pipeline, and people in gas and oil industry have known this for a long time, and international literature describes many problems and how workers need to be taken care of. And this also describes, in fact, that there is a problem with radioactivity, and we in the Marcellus Shale have even more radioactivity than places in Europe or other sources where these studies were done. So we really should take it seriously and not be sidelined by a criticism that there is no radioactivity of concern in the pipelines. They need to have protective measures, methodology to tell us how they're going to be dealing with it. Next slide. So I described the pigs. The pigs will, when they come out, they produce, you'll have this black powder that comes out the end of the pipeline, and that harbors anything that's coating the inside of the pipeline. But that could include bacteria, lead, polonium, PCBs, and potentially other contaminants, toxins. So we also have to be sure that the workers who are working at these areas are well protected, and that they're, that there's a plan in place for how this will be done and where this waste is going to go. Condensate tanks are also stored on premises at compressor stations because some of this gas is still wet. One of the reasons that they have to push the gas through is it might pick up some impurities along the way, so they need to clean it out at that compressor station as well, and so that waste, whatever will be deposited, needs to be taken care of. Norm materials can pose an inhalation risk when you're exposed to something like this, so you need to know the plan. Next one. So we know that there will be air impacts and possibly impacts on water and agriculture. Homes will be devalued. There will be tension in the community. We've seen this time and time again. Those one or two people who want to lease or who want to sell their land are going to be pushing to do this, and don't stand in their way without knowing. They need to study this. They need to be informed. They need to come to meetings like this to find out what the health impacts could potentially be for all the rest of you. Noise is a problem, especially for people living close by. The World Health Organization has determined that noise pollution raises the risk of heart attacks and increases blood pressure, causes cognitive defects in children, and it can interfere with their ability to learn. You need to know what the plan is for that. Common complaints. Nadia went over some of these already. These are some of the complaints that I've elicited from people that I've spoken with. And the possible long-term consequences is from the literature. What we know are the potential for those chemicals that I listed: nitrogen oxides, sulfur compounds, BTEX, volatile organic compounds, formaldehyde. What are the long-term consequences? And that's on the left part of the slide. Okay. I do have a number of anecdotes, but I think that to be a little bit brief, I won't go into all of the details because there are a number of them, and I can share that with you later. So what are your chances of becoming ill? The EPA, this is how the EPA figures out how many people are going to be at risk. And these are the measures that, these are the measurements that they take, and then they come up with a number. But what they're not taking into account is what are your particular susceptibilities, your vulnerabilities. Are you an older person? Are you a child? Do you have an underlying disease? Do you live, so is there a stress factor involved? These are factors that are not taken into account. Chemical sensitivities. Okay. So in addition to the problem with that way of determining risk and deciding whether or not it's acceptable to have 60,000 tons of toxic emissions, air pollutants in your atmosphere, there are other problems. Nadia touched on the fact that there are exemptions from key provisions of public health laws. You can actually look those up in those sources, and why we don't have more information in the oil and gas industry. But we are beginning to develop a source of several sources, compendia, and we're convinced that the problems that people are experiencing where we have spoken with them are real. For the most part, doctors are not trained to determine whether or not an impact is due to an environmental source. They don't ask those questions. That isn't part of the average doctor's training. And in most cases, the studies haven't looked at the vulnerable populations, which also includes the workers, I believe, because they're in contact with this material all the time. Then there are non-disclosure agreements. Some of the anecdotes will never come to the attention of a public health agency because I spoke with them, and then soon after they signed non-disclosure agreements because they had good cases, and industry knew that, and so they are not able to speak any further with a federal public health agency, for example. Okay. But there is a process that could bring public health to the table, and that would address vulnerable populations and would involve all stakeholders, and that's a health impact assessment. There needs to be political will to be advised by those results, and it should always be done before the process, either the regulations or the permits are issued, so that the powers that be can be advised by the literature and by the information that's produced. So yes, you would have risk assessment as part of it. You could have several risk assessments for all of the different chemicals. So, you know, you pick a chemical, you do a risk assessment. That's only one part of it. You also do surveys, like the kind of work that Nadia has been doing with people. You have stakeholder meetings where everybody says what is on their minds and what is of concern to them. You do literature searches. So it's a very exhaustive process, and it takes a while. But like I said, there needs to be political will to do that. The Medical Society of the State of New York asked for a moratorium because they felt that 3 years ago we didn't have enough information. 3 years ago they asked for a moratorium on gas drilling. Last year they asked for the health impact assessment. And this year they asked for a study on radon because they have enough information to be concerned about it. So what are some of the things that you can request as residents? Well, I would urge you that you ask for hearings, both with the Department of Environmental Conservation of New York State and also with FERC, which is the federal agency that the permit goes to. And that you ask for that cumulative environmental impact study and to include a health impact assessment. It doesn't have to be that title. It could be a comprehensive health impact study, but to include all of the parameters on health is required by the National Environmental Policy Act. So that's something that you can ask for. You need baseline measurements: air, methane, water, and also the radioactivity. Even though they'll say there is not, you pursue that as, you know, something that you would like to have done. And as a matter of fact, in countries other than the United States, where we have an exemption to anything that comes from downhole, which means any of the waste that comes up does not have to be monitored a specific way, especially the radioactivity we have an exemption to, is under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Everywhere else, it's mandated that they have norm management. NORM is naturally occurring radioactive materials, NORM management plans, as well as other hazardous materials management plans. You should ask for all of those things to protect yourselves. Best technologies, and also an electric compressor rather than a gas-powered one. Gas is better than a diesel-powered compressor station, but electric is even better. Next one. And just a slide here with the compendia of sources. And like I said, I'll make my presentation available to you as well. Thank you.